It sounds like there's going to be a bunch of Warhammer 40k rules changes coming in this new Arks of Omen book, but let's talk about one of them in specific today, and what the changes to reserves might mean going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about these new updates to Warhammer 40k in the Arks of Omen season. We've really got a lot of details, both from Games Workshop and from some leaks, but one thing that Games Workshop clarified themselves specifically was that strategic reserves are going to be completely command point free going forward into the new season. I feel like putting things in strategic reserve had become a bit more of a niche choice, at least for some armies. Not unusable, but quite a lot of armies just didn't really have the command points for it once they paid for things like pre-game upgrades and any detachments that they were using. Now it's completely command point free to do so, the mechanic's just a lot more interesting than it was, so I thought it was worth revisiting and talking about how making it command point free means that a lot of options are just a lot more viable to do it with than they would have been before. So putting things in reserve for free hasn't exactly been a new idea to Warhammer 40k. You could do it in 7th edition and prior, but in 8th edition it basically kind of completely went away. The only things that you were allowed to keep in reserve were things that could deep strike, say like Terminators or jump infantry. Anything else that didn't have special deployment rules like that had to start on the board. The idea behind wanting to was kind of simple though. Keep a segment of your army off the board to better react to the enemy or potentially keep it safe. There's a few different reasons that you might want to do so, which we'll talk about in a second. In 9th edition though, strategic reserves became a thing once more, paying 1 command point per 9 power level or 2 per 19 and so forth, and that amount of units could start off the board and then emerge at one of the sides. It was very useful and usable for some armies, particularly ones without many deep strike mechanics, though it did become far more niche in Nephilim, where you only had 6 command points worth of pre-game spend, and you might want those command points for the detachment slots, warlord traits, relics, and potentially big alpha strike stratagems turn 1. Compared with all that, strategic reserves just often didn't make the cut. Now in Arks of Omen, Games Workshop seems to have decided that command points are basically going to be used just for buying in warlord traits and relics and things, and you're not going to need them for say detachment slots or strategic reserves, and basically reduce the pressure a bit on that pre-game CP spending. It means that before the game it sounds like you're just going to be able to choose which units that you want to put in strategic reserve, potentially try and outflank the enemy or turn up in your own deployment zone, and it just makes it viable for a whole bunch of units that you just wouldn't ever have considered it for before. I thought we could just briefly do a refresher on how strategic reserves work, then talk about just a few of the best uses for it, and what things might become a bit more common with Arks of Omen. First up, I feel like the majority of people know how strategic reserves work by now, but I must admit the rule isn't quite as intuitive as some of them. I was playing it slightly wrong myself for a fair bit at the start of 9th edition. The way it works is that you nominate units to put up in strategic reserve before the game begins. Previously it would cost you command points, 1 command point for units totaling a power level of 1 to 9, 2 CP for 10 to 19, though I guess that entire system is going to be thrown out the window. I would guess that the previous restriction from missions though, saying that you can't put any more than half of your army in reserve in one form or another, will probably stay. It does mean that you couldn't just strategic reserve everything, not that that would probably be the best idea. I think Games Workshop wants to see the reserves as the extras and not the main event perhaps. Then, even though it's not forbidden in the core rules, on turn 1 you usually can't deep strike or strategic reserve or anything, the actual mission rules tend to prevent that, at least in the match play ones. So basically your options normally for turning up from reserve are either turn 2 or turn 3. On turn 2, anything in strategic reserve can turn up within 6 inches of any of the board edges besides your opponent's one. The opponent's one is marked on each deployment map. And there's 2 other further restrictions, meaning that you can't set up in the enemy deployment zone at all on turn 2, and you also must drop at least 9 inches away from the foe unless you happen to set up within your own deployment zone, in which case you could potentially set up very close indeed and have a very easy charge. Then it's pretty much the same for turn 3, all the rest of your units must come on now or they count as destroyed, and then it's similar restrictions to turn 2 except you can set up within the enemy deployment zone, provided you're within 6 inches of a board edge that isn't theirs. Turn 3 could be a bit more helpful for striking at the enemy backfield if you need to. I think it's a mechanic that's certainly better or worse for certain armies. Some armies just have some really great units for putting in strategic reserve, and against some opponents you might want to more or less. Certain elite armies are generally ones that you might have a fair bit of deployment choice against. Against big hordes and things taking over the entire board, it's probably a bad idea, as you might not get your forces any closer to the enemy as they'll be screened out. Let's talk through some of the best uses for strategic reserves though, and perhaps one of the most obvious is delivering high value damage dealers to actually be able to hurt their targets properly. I feel like in general a fair few armies that use this tend to have ranged units around about the 24-inch range mark, and maybe somewhat fragile or slow, but a high value and dangerous enough to actually be worth investing the command points for and putting them in reserve. I think bonus points if they don't have to take any movement penalties when they come onto the board as well. I feel like there's a few things that might make you not want to put them in strategic reserve. Say if they move very fast anyway, they're probably going to be able to bring themselves to bear on the board. And of course anything with a better deep strike, say for example Terminators or jump infantry, they're going to be able to jump down anyway, so they don't really need to go in strategic reserve. Perhaps just for common examples, I say that Space Marine Eradicators kind of exemplify that. Very dangerous guns, some of the most efficient anti-tank in the Marine Codex, a little bit short-ranged and predictable, seeing as they'll be starting on the board and only have 24 inches range, your opponent could outrange them. But turning up anywhere on the flanks at that kind of range usually means they're almost guaranteed to be able to get their melter into something juicy on the table. It perhaps might be kind of similar for Sisters of Battle Retributors, though I guess they will be taking the move and fire penalty. And sticking with the Adeptus Sororitas as well, I've also seen a few people use it with Repentia, who might have slightly more limited choices as to what they can charge out of reserve, but being able to lock in some very high charge results with Miracle Dice means they can actually get their Eviscerators into something pretty reliably. It really is a pretty handy mechanic, as it means that you've got a dangerous unit that you're pretty much guaranteed to get the damage output out of. If they kill more than their points value then and there, then all well and good. And then of course the opponent has to either deal with them or face another round of damage dealing, potentially with even more choice of targets. Definitely does have some downsides though. You'd miss out on any potential turn 1 damage, say if your opponent moved up and exposed all their units, then you wouldn't be able to strike them down turn 1. The enemy can potentially screen them out by putting units on the flanks, though having a couple of damage dealers in strategic reserve does mean that you could potentially step up to defend your deployment zone. Maybe in turn 2, if the enemy is pushed up too far, you could hit them back quite hard by turning up very close to them. Another really common choice is just for doing secondary objectives and actions and things. This used to be very common, particularly in Warzone Nakmundum before. Often getting troops units with say 5 models in them, turn up somewhere where they can do an action for a secondary objective, say retrieving data in a table quarter. They're cheap little expendable units that could have some decent value if they just do nothing but that, but then if they do survive and the enemy doesn't manage to deal with them, they could potentially be a bit disruptive from there, skirmishing with light infantry or contesting objectives. Having a bunch of small units in strategic reserve could be just quite irritating for the enemy in general, having to move units to deal with small threats they don't really want to have to. And it could also have a bit of synergy with things like engage on all fronts, getting small units that count into it into different table quarters. Units like perhaps Skitarii Vanguard or Drukhari Rack seem pretty ideal for this. Very cheap units that can turn up and do their job, and potentially aren't too bad at skirmishing with enemy light infantry once they get that done. Pretty nice to be able to take away some objectives with objective secures. Otherwise, and something I feel is a lot more viable now, is the idea of trying to keep some units safe from being killed first, basically protecting some mainline elements of your army from being alpha struck straight off the table. Say for example, you were playing Imperial Knights with a whole bunch of armigers and you weren't able to hide them all, or the same for Imperial Guard and you have a whole bunch of Lehman Russ tanks and you don't have the terrain to keep them all safe if the enemy gets turn 1. Putting a few of them in strategic reserve might be quite sensible. It means they might be able to get some better lines of sight when they do turn up in turn 2, and if all they're going to do turn 1 is going to be on the board and then die if the enemy gets turn 1, you might not necessarily be losing out on all that much. Could be relevant as well if you've got other things that hit very hard but the enemy's got some way of reaching them. Going back to Sisters of Battle again, say if you had some Retributors outside of transports and the enemy had some very good artillery or flyers that would just be able to kill them dead from long range, you might be better off putting them in reserve to keep them safe and guarantee that they at least get some firepower. Definitely has a bit of an overlap of delivering damage dealers, but here maybe the primary motivation is to make sure the unit doesn't die first, as opposed to get them in range or anything. Again, there's definitely some downsides as well as positives to this. You don't want to be putting too much of your army in strategic reserve, otherwise you won't have very much turn 1 threat, and potentially if you were going first and the enemy had some units that you might well have wanted to damage, you might lose out a bit there. Probably means that you don't really want to be putting ridiculous amounts of your army in reserve, but might be quite good for a portion of your battle line if you can't keep all of them safe. Otherwise, just messing with enemy positioning or attacking their home field objectives are both pretty handy. It can just be quite disruptive to the enemy battle plan just to have a few units of any sort of threat turn up near their home field objectives or back somewhere where they're going to have to move to engage you. You could go for a bit of a distraction Carnifex type approach with this, say for example put one Custodius Dreadnought out of your army in strategic reserve have that turn up on the flank, and then say if your opponent was playing an assault army, they've got the choice between going back and trying to charge something back in their own deployment zone, or keep their units moving forward and know that you've got something that's probably going to be threatening their home field objectives or back line. Could be done just as well with a unit of infantry capable of beating whatever the enemies put on their home field objective, have them arrive hopefully 9 inches away, and potentially try and make a charge on that unit, beat it in combat and take away the objective for a turn. Finally, there's also a few armies that have some special rules that play around with Strategic Reserve, maybe the Eldar Webway Gates being one of the best. That one allows you to have Strategic Reserves turn up in the middle of the board, potentially somewhere that's very close to an objective, and then it can allow you to fight over that pretty efficiently. The Gates already discounted Strategic Reserves, but it does only make it more viable if they're completely free. I guess Arks of Omen reserve rules will be a small effective buff for that. Otherwise, some things like the Tau positional relay could allow a unit to arrive from Strategic Reserve a round earlier, though I must admit a fair few of the things that you'd want to with Tau Empire can deep strike anyway via a Manta. And I guess it could theoretically be interesting for the Necron Prismatic Dimensional Breach stratagem. That's when you put a scary melee unit or something in Strategic Reserve, and then you get to beam them out of a night side very close for a near guaranteed charge. I suppose that one might interact weirdly with the rumoured flyer rules. There was some talk of flyers having to start in Strategic Reserve themselves. I don't know whether or not that will be playable if the flyer itself has arrived from Strategic Reserve the same turn. Definitely anything that got on well with Strategic Reserve though and wasn't already free gets a big lift out of this. So if Strategic Reserves are now free, then what are the changes that people might be making to how they play with their armies? Obviously the whole tactic of putting things in reserves, either to keep things safe, deliver damage dealers, or do objectives and things, all of that's just going to become a lot more viable. I feel like a lot of armies might make use of it, even if it's just having 1 or 2 units in reserve and most of it starts on the board. I guess some armies are going to care about this far more than others. In general, I think it's going to be a bit of a lift to any armies that didn't already have reserve mechanics, say having whole army deep strike like the Chaos Demons do, or similar for armies like Grey Knights, or armies where a lot of their best units could deep strike anyway. I'd say perhaps the most interesting changes for command point cost are perhaps that you can now afford to use Strategic Reserves for units that are just very tiny and wouldn't have been worth spending a command point on for before. Say if you just literally had a 5-man troops unit that you might not have wanted to waste the CP on previously, now you can just throw them in to Strategic Reserve to be an annoying disruption or do actions and things and not have to worry about the command point cost. I feel like at least a fair few armies will probably want to make use of that, at least in certain matchups. Getting a few more bodies doing actions and then threatening objectives where they're needed to doesn't sound like a bad idea at all. On the other end of the spectrum though, I think it's really going to help out really big units that you wouldn't have wanted to pay the serious command point cost to put them in reserve before. If you really wanted, you could be putting things like Imperial Knights or other super heavies in reserve, or even things like Demon Primarchs potentially, particularly against armies that you might be worried are just going to shoot them straight off the table, no questions asked. I'd still say it's not exactly ideal. Generally with big scary models like these, you tend to want them on the board from turn 1 anyway, and if you can manage to hide them behind terrain or something, and then jump them out to be a big threat to the enemy, that's probably going to be better as you get to use them from turn 1 onwards. If you're absolutely sure though that the enemy is just going to have the long range firepower to deal with them, and you can't hide them behind terrain, either because they're a super heavy or 18 wounds or something, or there's just not enough terrain on the board, and putting a chunk in reserve seems like a very sensible idea. Better to have them arrive turn 2 a tiny bit late to the party, but actually get to deal effective damage from then onwards. As I mentioned before though, I think it's still likely to be only used for a few units out of an army, probably not going to be seeing people putting half their army in Strategic Reserve or anything like that. You still need some decent threat on the board and moving things onto objectives turn 1. And some matchups are just going to be very bad for screening them out if the enemy's got lots of units running around that they can put on the flanks. Overall though, definitely became a bit more of an interesting part of the game. I feel like just by the nature of reserves, you're probably not going to see people go too crazy on it even though it's free, just because there are trade-offs to taking units off the board. Let me know your thoughts though. How good do you think that the Strategic Reserves are going to be when we've got these new missions? And could you see yourself doing anything differently with your army now that they are going to be free? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments as always. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k discussion coming. I'm looking forward to digging into these new changes a bit more deeply when we actually get the official rules. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.